Okay, so thank you very much for coming. First of all, let me just give a huge thank you to the people who've taken the time to come in person. I know it can be a bit challenging, and one of the things we were asking ourselves on the way over here is, okay, who remembers what floor conference room 21 is? So there are extra things that have to happen when you come in person, but that's why I want to really take the moment to honor and thank everybody who took the extra effort to come here in person. I really appreciate it, and I know my colleagues here do as well. So thank you very much. That said, I also know that there's a lot of people who have situations that are complicated that doesn't allow them to come in person. And this is the advantage of having a hybrid meeting, is that people who, for whatever reason, have to be home, can't travel, etc., can still join in the meeting. So thank you to those who came, and thank you as well for those who are remotely who are joining. I believe we'll be doing we're recording this, we'll be circulating that. Some housekeeping matters. There will be at the end a little question survey. Some of the times we've done that, we got some feedback early on when I started these that they were a bit information dense. So we've tried to tighten that up. If you find that there's too much information, please take the survey and let us know. If you find it's the wrong information, that's also really helpful. And we'll go into the comm survey we did to pick up some of that. So let's get started. And I don't see the slides. So very visual. Okay, so let's go to the agenda. Thank you. Okay, so we'll just go over a few things first. Since we are at the end of the year, I think many of you have noticed that. We just thought we'd take a look at some of our accomplishments. It's been a heavy year. A lot of people have said they feel it's been a heavy year, but it's also been a year where we've done a lot, and I really appreciate everybody's work. I also wanted to give you a sense of what we're thinking about as priorities for next year. We on the podium have had some discussions about that, and of course it's something that when we discuss that, if you want to give feedback, again, feel free to send information if you think that the direction is maybe not where you would go. We have survey results, as well as a little bit about the staff engagement survey, which you recall from last year. We'll talk about the SHP, which is an issue of great importance for all of us since we're all being impacted by that. A little bit about business continuity. A little bit about the budget. There's not much to say there, which is a good thing. We'll talk about admin matters a little bit affecting the staff, and then we'll have a Q&A. I'll try to go quickly so we have more time for Q&A. That said, I know I speak quickly, and I know that not everybody is as ease at listening in English as they might be. So if especially, I will ask my colleague Marie, who will let me know if I'm going too fast. So next slide, please. So just to take a look at where we've been, and it's interesting, it's not really post-COVID because we're sitting here in a mask, and I know many colleagues who recently had COVID. However, we're fortunate that COVID is not as serious as it had been. And we've also had 2 years experience with COVID. One of the things you can see is that we're back almost where we were before, particularly with meetings with interpretation. Meetings with interpretation is the key statistic here because that's where all of the effort and resources goes into. We used to like to say, oh, we do 12,000 meetings a year. A lot of that was people were just getting a room. So they didn't really it didn't cost us anything to do. Our colleagues at MMS set them up with the room. The people were there, they met. People don't do much of that anymore. We all learned through COVID that we don't have to come together physically. So a lot of the meetings that used to happen, we believe, are now just fully virtual. And if they're meetings that don't require conference services, then we don't know about those. People don't need to ask MMS to use Teams or use their own Zoom license. So my feeling is that for the next, we'll never see numbers over 12,000 again. And in fact, I'll be surprised if we get to numbers over 10,000 again. One thing that I think is important is you can see that we're back to a great deal to having a lot of in-person meetings, which is very good. We still have a lot of hybrid meetings. About 70% of our meetings with interpretation still have a hybrid component. This is very different from New York. In New York, it's less than 10%. So New York is very much back into in-person, and the member states are very keen that people are physically in the building. Here at UNOG, our situation is a bit different. I always like to mention that we do more meetings with interpretation than any other duty station, so congratulations to everybody who was working on that. And we also do more summary records than any other duty station. And I know that that affects the English translation section primarily, but I also understand the huge amount of work that's involved with that and the close coordination with MMS and our colleagues in the Secretariat. Next slide. So let's talk about documentation as well. There's a bit less variability in the documentation stat. So we saw in the meetings that there was this 12,000 number. 2020, there was a big dip, and slowly it's been climbing back up. The documentation number, we had a very large 79.5 million words in 2019. It was a huge amount of work, and this was anomalous. Generally, we're much more in the 70, 71. So there was a small dip in 2020, and I think a fair amount of that was associated with, I think substantive secretariats didn't find it as easy to get work done. We had fewer meetings, and of course, meetings come with documentation. What we're seeing this year, however, is that it's all back. So we've gotten our meeting workload we saw on the previous slide back up. And what that means is, again, all those meetings come with documentation. We're also, and I'm not going to talk too much about the specificities about what's going on in the translation section, and we're going to have a separate town hall meeting on that because there's a lot to talk about. And so we'll touch on some of that. I mean, of course, you're free to ask whatever you want in the Q&A, but I'm not going to get too much in depth into that. When is the town hall with LS set?
It's going to be next week. It's going to be next week on Thursday. We're trying to get a room, and so we're waiting for confirmation about the room.
Okay, so the town hall for language service will be in a week, so next Thursday. So, but what I want to say, first of all, I think it's really important to see, look at how this productivity rate has gone on. This is a representation of a huge amount of work and effort from our colleagues in very challenging circumstances. So I just thank you all very much. I've recently spent a lot of time digging into what's going on. And I also want to note in the same period, the number of special assignments have also gone down dramatically. So when you look at all of the various numbers, it's really an impressive picture. It's also a picture of a service that's under a lot of pressure and under a lot of stress. I also want to remark, I always talk about the triangle: cost, timeliness, and quantity. There's been, throughout this period, there was 100% issue compliance for documents submitted on time within estimated word limits. So this is also impressive, and this is another sign that in addition to improving the productivity, people didn't just do that through issuing documents late. So very impressive. Next slide. So accomplishments for the year, I've already gone into some of them. Let's start with the first one, IT tools. So I would say probably 5/6, okay, maybe it's actually 3/4 of the division has been impacted by the rollout of GDoc. So for those who are not involved in that, and that would only be interpretation, GDoc is the documentation management processing system. This has been a huge thing. It's been under discussion since I think 2016, but the real work really started last year, I would say. And it was decided to roll out GDoc everywhere all at once at the same time, I think in August of last year, but we volunteered to actually be a late adopter, which I think worked out well. We had GDoc roll out here in November 1st. There's a lot that's still going on. GDoc is not done. There's a lot of work in a lot of different directions. The reprise calculator, issues having to do with the calendar, issues impacting production, printing and distribution, programming officers, work share, et cetera. So just for those who don't know, we have a weekly meeting on GDoc. So we have a weekly meeting with the focal points from across the division. We talk about what the issues are. Then people send in information via email. I send a message once a week to the Assistant Secretary General, highlighting usually a couple issues. Some of the issues we've highlighted is the lack of accessibility for GDoc. We've also highlighted concerns with the reprise calculator, et cetera. And then we follow up on that. So that's sort of a cycle. But I've put a lot of my personal attention into this because it's so important for our success and for the things that our colleagues are facing. We also developed, and this is a big kudo, the mandate review and management system. So this is something that was done. It's a four-stakeholder tool. The executive office was the key driver, but everybody, other parts of the House contributed, colleagues in financial management at UNOG, as well as the financial team, et cetera, in human rights, plus the financial team in New York. So this is something we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on. And in fact, this has been nominated for an award, one of the SG's awards, and you'll see that this is made it to the last round. So we'll be announcing that. We've also seen, for instance, major conferences away from Geneva. Just recently, UNFCCC and Sharm el Sheikh. Thank you very much to everybody who went. I know that was a particularly challenging conference. We had the UNDRR Global Platform in Bali in May. It seems like a long time ago. And almost at the same time, there was the desertification meeting in Abidjan. So we continue to service very big, very important meetings, and I thank everybody who works on that. We also did 3 regular sessions of the HRC, plus 2 bonus sessions, 2 special sessions on very important issues. Those I think have been quite well. And then this year we had the International Year of Glass, which may not have come to everybody's attention particularly, but proved to be very high profile and quite complicated. So thank you everybody for the work on those conferences. And then I also would like to thank very much Marie Dour for her work in supporting diversity. So we did recruit 7 temporary interpreters via special TJO to increase diversity. It's also to help the potential pool of people who will pass the SELP and ideally then come in and join our ranks permanently. This is something that was done collectively with DGACM in New York. There was an exception granted from OHR specifically to do this, and that I believe is going to be extended. We're waiting to hear what's happening. We've requested the same in translation because we'll see in a coming slide how important it is to increase the pool of freelancers in translation as well. So, but thank you very much, and a special thank you to Marie for the work that she did with that. And I really appreciate as well that the interpretation teams are making every effort to support our new colleagues and help them feel welcome. So thank you very much. Next slide. So our priorities for 2023. So now, of course, these are all opaquely named, but what is meant by fit for the future? The idea with this is tied up with 2 things. One is business continuity. Now, we've seen that hybrid meetings continue to be popular here in Geneva. I think you may be aware that hybrid meetings do not enjoy member state consensus. But I believe it's very important for our division to continue to actively engage in the future of conference. And this is something that the Director General as well is very keen that UNOG remain a modern conference center. So I want us to be a key part of that because it's you who understand how conferences work, and the people who work day in, day out can have ideas about, hey, we could make this better. So this is fit for the future. It's also tied up with SHP, making sure that when SHP is done, that those offices work for us, that the conference rooms work for us, and again, are fit for the future. I was in a meeting yesterday, totally as a backbencher, where DGACM was talking to the CEDO, and there was a big discussion in New York about the conferencing systems in New York. Now, those of you who've been around a while, remember the CMP, the Capital Master Plan, where they renovated all the conferences. Well, that tech is now old and it has to be kept up to speed. So one of the things we're pushing with SHP is that the technical backbone for conferences be robust enough that as conferencing changes, we'll be able to pick up and absorb new technology. Now, how does all this work? This requires partnerships, and this is something that's very key for me and it has been all along. We work very closely with DGACM. I mentioned that I report to DGACM on GDOC. I have a bi-weekly meeting with the ASG. I also meet regularly with the heads of Vienna and Nairobi to talk about things. We work very much in partnership with our colleagues in DOA. And that I think has been very good for UNOG. We also have relationships with the heads of conferencing at other international organizations. We have some partnerships with academics, et cetera. So when we work together, we're more likely to move things forward because there's a lot of stuff that's hard. And if you have other people with you supporting you, we can handle that burden a bit better. And then the other thing is strong foundations. Again, sounds good. What do I mean by this? The last couple of years have been really challenging, and there's been a lot of change. GDOC was a huge transformation in how we do our work, and it continues to transform. Hybrid conferencing, really huge transformation in the work of our interpretation colleagues, meetings management, colleagues in DOA. So lots of change that happened there. And what at this point, what I'm hoping for 2023 is that we have a bit of breathing space to let those changes sink in and settle. So instead of having constant turbulence, change, my hope is that we can have a bit for 23 for things just to settle a little bit, help give us a strong foundation where you can then move forward into the future. So these are my ideas. Again, if you have ideas when you think about that, you're like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Or yeah, I like that. Please feel free to send me an email or put that in the survey at the end. But of course, we're all in this together. But this is sort of my idea for the future. Next slide. So there was the staff engagement survey in 2021. And thank you to all of you who have participated. I think the participation was comparable to the prior years. The Director General held a town hall on this in October, so I won't go through all the details. You can see the 5 focus areas that we had. Also, we've put together in DCM some additional specific actions. One theme is having clarity of direction, is effectively communicating with staff and letting people understand what are we doing and why are we doing it. Certainly to the extent that we can share. We can't do this all the time. And then also picking up the role of staff in the decisions that affect their work. Now, of course, there's a framework for this, staff management consultations. I'm not so much thinking about the very formal staff management consultations, but more in the ongoing discussions that you have with your supervisors have with their chiefs, the chiefs have with me. We meet regularly. We meet every other week, and then we have sort of a mini retreat, aka lunch, once a month. But we talk about a lot of stuff. So there are opportunities for things to flow upward. Again, if you feel your message isn't being heard, please feel free to reach out. Occasionally, people get in touch with me, and I'm always happy to discuss. So let's take a look at the next slide, which is, so the communication survey. Thank you to those who took that. I know we all get way too many surveys, but we really appreciate those who took the time. I think it was about, was it 90 people? 98 people. So the majority, 3/4 of the people felt they were getting enough information. Unfortunately, 1/4 of people didn't think that they were getting enough information. Next slide. So one of the things we were interested in, what did people find helpful? So the most important thing, and I know this is hard to read, so it's a teeny slide, teeny font. The most important thing in the respondents was issues and trends affecting your work. What is the department's vision? HR matters and training. So these were considered the most important topics. We'll feed that into UNOG. We do try to have UNOG organize meetings on things that are across the UN that aren't just DCM specific. And we do occasionally send out emails and such, but I think we can do more on that. Next slide. So in that context, what do people find helpful? So people appreciated emails from my office. So thank you very much for the positive feedback. We do make an effort to really try to think, what is it people want to know? Because I recognize that those of us on the podium are involved in ongoing issues that sometimes you forget that we know all about this, but that doesn't mean that it necessarily goes elsewhere. So I do try in a communication standpoint to think, what is it that the interested reader would want to know? So thank you for that. People also appreciated meetings with section and service chiefs, as well as with the director. So, and again, what we want to do is strike a balance. We don't want to have too much, but we want to have just right. So this is again why we're so grateful for survey input. It was interesting to see the website, not a lot of love, or the iSeek pages, the USG's message. We do provide input to the USG's message, but I know there's a lot of material in there. Next slide. We also did a survey on training needs. Training is complicated because there's limited resources for training. Training is funded in a couple ways. There's what's known as USTS, but basically it's centrally funded training funds. We get about, it's been about 17,000 this year. So that's not a lot of money. There's 500 people in the division and $17,000 doesn't go very far. That said, there's all sorts of other opportunities, the LinkedIn training, there's online training, CLM, et cetera. But we understand that there's often specific needs for people. So this gives you a sense of who responded. Next slide. There were a variety of needs that people were looking at. We did ask specifically some questions on language staff. One of the things people were interested in was adding a language as a translator. I know that our interpreter colleagues also are interested in this. This is challenging because it's a question really of time and resources. And there's a difference between somebody who's a language professional adding a language and me taking classes to improve my French. So I, for instance, my French has slowly over the years gotten better, but I am absolutely not at a level where I could work 100% in that. So for you to be able to translate from an additional language or interpret from an additional language, it's a huge commitment. We know people do it and we appreciate it. That said, the question comes down to whether or not there is capacity in the section to allow people to go. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later in additional slides about the backlog. And I'm just going to sort of mention, we have about a month and a half worth of work in backlog. Now, it's different across the languages, but we're in a situation right now where we have a lot of pressure and a lot of work that hasn't been completed. So we're not really in an area where we can release people for a lot of training right now. This is also complicated because it's proven difficult to get additional freelance staff. So if we had the possibility to get freelance staff regularly, then that would be one thing. We could hire somebody and that would free other people up to go and invest and do other things. We're not really in that situation. And this is disappointing because I always like to have good news, but if there's no good news, it's better to be upfront about it, I think. This said, if there's something that you're interested in, please discuss it with your manager. There might be things that are good investments, or there might be time. We may find as well as we expand the GLR, as we're able to, if we get more people on board, that we'll have more capacity. But I'm sorry to be a bit discouraging because we see that people are so interested in this. But the main take home for this for you is if you're interested in something like that, discuss with your manager. If somebody is given time off work to develop a language, it has to be a language that the section would need. And then there has to be a commitment from the staff members that they will, within a certain time, begin using that language professionally. So this, of course, is a bit more complicated. So there may be specific situations where this is necessary, but I would say it's more likely to be the exception. In general, our focus is on group training. So for instance, if we have somebody come and give a lecture on, legal terminology in Arabic, or have somebody talk maybe specifically about how better to set up a hybrid conference or something. So the preference is to give shorter group training on very targeted events. I know that might be a little disappointing, but that's the situation we're in right now. Next slide. We also and then one other thing that was interesting, people are quite interested in workshops that strengthen teamwork and communication. So that we need to do more of. So, and one of the things that's interesting, there's talk about setting up courses on use of nonviolent communication, which is a way to improve how people communicate in resolving conflicts. It's something I've had some experience with, and it's very positive. But we will work on that. It's the perfect example, group classes, and that don't take too much time. Next slide. So there's a little bit more about specialized courses, and we'll share this PowerPoint with you so you'll be able to take a look at that in more detail because these are very small. Also, there's the Quintet of Change, which is a series of priorities that the Secretary General has, and people were particularly interested in behavioral science. And there's a lot of interesting stuff on that. You might have heard about something called nudges. For instance, it's like when you have a reminder pop up in your computer to take a 5-minute walk or whatever. I mean, that's a very simple example, but we will see if we can get some more coursework in this area. So let's talk a little bit, the update on the task force recommendations. I said I'm not going to go too much into what's going on with language service, but the Undersecretary General of DGACM on November 15th approved the recommendations that were made by the different task forces. I think there were six different task forces, or was it 7? So there were a number of different task forces. This was a several-year process. There was many rounds of consultation and such, but these recommendations have been approved. We're updating DGACM's policies. And then we're going to have standardized work practices across the 4 duty station. We'll also be updating the compendium. The compendium is still available online. And if you ever go into the compendium and you see something that seems wrong, do send an email to somebody, because it's good to keep that up to date. So Cecilia and Michelle, who are the co-chairs of the harmonization group, they'll be following up on the implementation. There'll be a matrix that will be posted on the dedicated SharePoint site. So there'll be a lot of information about how that is going to proceed. This is going to be a many-month process for this implementation, but I know Michelle has already started. Again, we're going to go much more in depth into that next Thursday. The Director of Central Planning and Coordination in New York, Xiaoma, will be liaising with the global project teams across the duty stations to ensure any changes required to our systems are implemented promptly. So there's a couple systems. There's GMeets, which doesn't tie in to this that much. There's GDoc, which we've talked about. And then there's also GData, where Vitali is the project executive. So all of these systems will be updated to reflect these new decisions. And I know many of them are very important and have an impact on people's productivity in their day-to-day work. But as I said, we'll discuss at the Thursday meeting. So let's switch to the SHP. Here's the Strategic Heritage Plan. Okay, so big changes. So we all thought that the E-building was going to be closed at the end of the year. Well, this isn't happening. It's at this point, they're looking at it being closed in mid-July. Why is this? Well, due to COVID, the contractor wasn't able to make as much progress as they had expected. And we also have the Director General's very firm commitment that we will not close the E-building and conference rooms like this one until the conference rooms in AB, AC, and Assembly Hall are back online. That means that they've returned from SHP, they've been fully tested by DOA along with our interpreter colleagues, and they are ready to work. So the expectation is that will be done by mid-July. E-building will close. So you can see here, again, we will share this in more depth. The Tempest has been converted. It used to be 3 conference rooms. Now it's 1 giant conference room. When E-building closes, we'll have the Assembly Hall and Tempest as the 2 large rooms. In principle, we should have about the same capacity we have now in terms of rooms. It'll just be with fewer seats. We will see how it happens, how this rolls. AC is supposed to be coming back at the beginning of next year, and then AB and A will follow. No moves are currently planned for the staff. Let's show the next slide, please. No moves are planned for the staff. You can see this until March. So the little red splotches here are when we expect people to start moving. So the first moves would be into the building D, that's some of the language service sections. Then there'd be moves into building AC, S1, etc. And then building A, you see that's right near the end. So we will see how this all plays out. I hope it's not the case, but I expect there may be some play. As a rule, everybody will get 60 days notice when they need to move. So that's, and then I assume a lot of people, those of you telecommuting, a lot have already probably made adjustments in your office in terms of having the equipment that you need and such. But we won't, we have firm dates, we'll have another town hall meeting on it to talk about it with the transition team. As a rule, everyone is supposed to have their own desk. We are not planning to have any hot desking. Seating for language services still under discussion with SHP, partly because the section C, building C, won't be available before they close E-building. So that does mean there'll be some additional adjustments with language service when building C opens up. There's also issues having to do with how PSS and the workshop will be laid out. Those are still under discussion, and the 2 distribution counters. If you have any questions or focal points in your service, we can provide more information. Next slide, please. So business continuity, this is a nice anodyne way of talking about the fact that we still have hybrid meetings. So Director General has decided that UNOG will still be under business continuity until for the first half of 2023. Part of this is because certain countries, it's difficult to travel. It's difficult to travel in and out of China, for instance. So delegations still can't all be here all the time. We'll see what happens as things evolve, but what this means is we will continue to have a hybrid component for many meetings through the first half of next year. Depending on what happens with the SHP, et cetera, and what's happening with the situation with COVID and other things, there may be an extension. We'll see what happens. As a rule, what we do is we do 3-hour meetings with 30-minute limit of remote participation. That works pretty well. If they want more remote participation than that, it's a 2-hour meeting. We're still sticking with that. So we don't incur any extra additional cost for this because we're not, as a rule, putting a reinforced interpretation team with every meeting. But the Division of Administration does incur costs. They have to have sound text, the platform, et cetera. So the expectation is the arrangements they have now will continue next year. Next slide. So you may have wondered about the energy crisis. The energy crisis so far hasn't been too bad here. Of course, we had a lovely fall. November was gorgeous. But there, of course, now that winter is coming, people are quite concerned. Switzerland has put together a plan, of course, and because it's Switzerland, there's a federal plan and a cantonal plan. And DOA has been working with the canton and such to figure out what we're going to do. There's several scenarios that are planned. I guess we have 2 slides on this. Okay. So this basically describes all of this. There was a task force, et cetera. There's been discussions. This was what we saw with how the coordination happened with COVID was pretty much just mapped over to the energy crisis. So there have been discussions with other international organizations, neighboring France, et cetera. Next slide. So the current scenario, so at this point, we've all been asked to be careful about, turn the lights off, keep the heat down. Sort of like living at home where your dad is always, close the door. But basically that means we can still work as normal. If this starts getting difficult, there may be a requirement for large energy consumers, such as UNOG, to reduce its consumption 20%. If that happens, we might ask people to work from home more. We may close certain buildings, which might mean people might have to move in different directions. There'd be further reductions to heating. I see that a lot of people are wearing scarves, have coats. There might need to be more of that. No space heaters. But if this comes to play, this will trigger discussions about the potential for scenario 2. Scenario 2 is the idea there may be planned power shutdowns. They call it load shedding, which is a nice term of art, which is effectively a power shutdown in a specific area. It would be for up to 6 hours. We've provided information back to DOA to share with the Swiss to say, hey, if you're going to do a 6-hour shutdown, please do it so it's either all in the morning or in the afternoon, but don't have it go from 11 to 4, which would disrupt 2 meetings. The Director General has said that SHP and conferencing have the highest priority for energy, but if we have power outages at that point, the best we could do possibly is to run a conference in Tempest. Tempest has we think could be run by the generator. They can't test it until we start getting into scenario 1B. We've had a meeting with clients about this, and we've agreed with clients that as soon as we get into the 20% cut, we'll then start figuring out what we would do if we had to cancel meetings. We would get 48 hours notice. And because we're so squeezed with conference room, it's not like we could just have, oh, okay, you don't have a meeting today, fine, you'll do it tomorrow. Because tomorrow already has meetings scheduled in it. Hopefully it's not going to come to that, but if it is, we'll figure out a way to figure out with the clients what we're going to do. And it all depends also on where it is. If all of this part of the lake is shut down, well, the Palais Wilson conferences would stop as well as here. If not, so we don't know what is going to happen yet, but we will keep you posted. So that's the energy crisis. Just a thought, I do remember there was a question of if people were told to, there was an energy crisis here, we shut down the building. Would people be expected to say, find an open place and work off their phones or something? We believe that no, this would be a force majeure situation, and that would not be the case, that we would record this. There'd be some sort of special assignment. So we're not expecting you to buy generators and have the solar panels on your house so you can run your laptop and work with a candle. But we'll provide more information on that too when we get the details. Budget proposal. So what our 2023 budget proposal was very basically status quo. DGACM decided to reprogram my old post from PSS and move it to New York. And it looks like the member states are going to accept that. And we transferred one post from subprogram 4, which I think it was from printing or distribution, a vacant post, and we put it to program support, which program support is basically the IT colleagues. So there were no abolitions, no new posts were requested. We are expecting to get a comparable level of resources. The controller has indicated that it's unlikely we'll be under this financial pressures like we used to when we had the liquidity crisis. We will see. One thing that is sometimes impacts us is if the member states decide to mandate a very high vacancy rate. But we are filling posts to the approved vacancy rate for this year. And we don't, so basically, this is a slide to say we don't expect any drama from the budget next year. But we'll all find out when the fifth committee and the GA make their decisions at the end of the month. And then we'll have another meeting in the first quarter of the year to let people know. Next slide. So retirements, people are continuing to retire, no surprise. So right now we're at 497 people. You can see, so we have some Ps, some Gs, they're in different places in different sections. It makes perfect sense to me that given that people often have about a 30-year career, that about a third of the people over 10 years are retiring. But this does mean that there is turnover. As always, the retirements, it's not that they're necessarily evenly sprinkled across the house. Some sections may have a lot of retirements coming. Some sections may have no retirements scheduled for 10 years or so. But this just gives you a sense of where that is. Next slide. So staff pay actually, yeah, there we go. So pay did go up 3.1% for P staff. I was happy. I think we all appreciated that. There was a little bump in February and a bump in August. And G staff pay has gone up 2.9%. So that happened in October. There's been some changes to the UN staff selection system. The STAI here was updated. And the mobility policy, you may recall this was rolled out and there was a big discussion of it, but then there was subsequent consultations with staff, the staff unions, and they've now are adjusting that. My understanding is it's going to be significantly scaled back. So as soon as that's finalized, we will share with people what's going to happen with that. But the idea at some point that it was really going to be more of a big bang with lots of people moving, I think it seems like it's more going to be opt-in for existing staff, and new staff, and this is new staff, will be the ones who will be affected. There's also internal vacancy announcements. This has been something that was in DGACM for a long time. That has been formally suspended. I think you might have noticed that in the September USG message. They're waiting to see, I think, what happens with mobility. We're continuing to work with DGACM to discuss whether or not job openings can be posted for P3 level language staff. In principle, the idea is that P3 interpreter and translator posts should be and editor and proofreader, et cetera, posts should all be filled from the CELB. Now, that's the language roster. If the language roster is exhausted, and that means really exhausted, not just that somebody called somebody and they said, I don't think I want it. If the language roster is fully exhausted, then we should, in my opinion, be able to advertise a job opening, but there's some difference of opinion on that. And there's, so the ASG has formally asked OHR in New York to say, is this possible? So as soon as we get clearance on that, we'll share that with people. But again, that would be for positions where the language roster is exhausted, then those would be advertised. And that would be an opportunity for people to move laterally from other duty stations. There's also new INSMIS rules for corrective glasses and lenses. So that's good. Somebody who's just a new glasses user, again, I'm happy for that. So this is the kind of, I hope this is the sort of stuff that's useful. And whether you want more or less of this, but this is partly here in response to the survey. Now, this is the exciting news. So in addition to the language service town hall on Thursday, after that, we'll be having the holiday party for the division. It's going to be on the second floor on the mezzanine. For those of you who've already signed up, thank you for your contribution. We're ordering food, drinks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's still possible. If you're interested, just let Antigone or Isabel, who are right there, know. It is 25 francs. There'll be a pub quiz, a Kahoot, there'll be dancing, karaoke, photo booth, et cetera, and we hope to see you there. Okay, so finally, we're down to the Q&A stage. So what I thought I'd do is just, again, in recognition of the people who've taken the time to come in, we'll start with questions from the floor. And then after that, assuming time permits, we'll take questions from online. And thank you for your patience. I know I went on a bit long. So. Laura, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I agree with you about the I can't remember what it was called though. Not too many changes next year. Strong foundations or something. So just a very small bit of feedback to start with. The last bit of a slide with all that information, it was very useful and a lot of it was good news. But I have to say the title of it was so vague as to be slightly ominous, that people may have been concerned that there was some bad news announcement coming. So also on that subject, I'd like to know how will that be reconciled with making all these changes that are going to be made after the task force reports in languages service. And then just finally, on the staff engagement survey, I noted that a specific thing for DCM was staff participation in decisions affecting them, and that you said that this will be more through informal routes of encouraging staff to come forward, which is of course great, and when people can do that. But I'm also wondering if this is a particular point for DCM that does include a need to include the formal routes of staff management consultations with staff representatives, given that especially that we work in an organization where that's not optional. It's part of the system. And will we also continue to ensure in the future that we have consultations on all the issues affecting staff? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura, for those points, and thank you for the feedback. That's good. And so we'll keep an eye on the titling of the slides, because I agree. Last thing people need is, oh, here he comes. So that's good. And on the strong foundations, the sort of limiting changes, there's what we can limit and there's what externally imposed changes. So kind of what I mean by that is I'm not planning on pushing any big new initiatives from within the division. That said, we still have to clean up, as you rightly pointed out, changes from the task forces. So there's still lingering changes that need to sort of be resolved, finalized, and get taken care of. That's GDOC, that's the task force changes. And there, of course, if it's externally imposed, we have to deal with it. But I'm going to try to be like, hey, can we put this off? Can we postpone it? Let's see where things are. On the thought on the informal consultation, this really gets to the heart of where we are in integrated global management. So the member states have set that DGACM they set our budget, which they do, we consult into that, but the ultimate authority for that sits with USG Abelian. And they also set the conference servicing policy. So that anything to do that's specific to conference servicing is really led from DGACM. And one of the things I try to do is to be clear on what is specific conference policy, and all the work that you and your colleagues have done on those staff consultations has been very much in the context of conference servicing only, versus things that are UNOG general policies. So for instance, with the mobility policy, there's a UN-wide mobility policy, then there's questions specifically for language staff. So there's things that we can do here at the divisional level, but if it's involving conference servicing policy, I can't trigger any specific formal consultations. We feed that into DGACM, but ultimately formal consultations in the context of conference servicing policy come from DGACM. And if it's something specific in the division, it'd be difficult for me to think of something that would be only for the division, but then in that case, we work more closely with UNOG as well, with the Director General. I think it's hard to describe how the matrix management thing plays out exactly, but that's my understanding of it. But maybe Michelle, do you want to add any thoughts on Laura's points?
So I think that many colleagues have heard me talk about zone of influence and zone of control, and how much more satisfying it is to work in your zone of influence and zone of control. And so I think that what Kira was pointing out is that there's things that I, as the chief of the language service, I can control and I can change. And then there's things that I can try and influence, which is what I try and do. And to a certain extent, and I think that when we're talking about consultations, this is exactly what is meant by consultations. You know, it's to have a clear understanding of what we can control, what we can influence, and how we can try and influence things. So, for example, a lot of the work that I do is I, of course, work through Kira to ask her to intervene directly with the Ms. Norman Chalet about issues that are of concern. And I do this after seeking the advice of my chiefs of section and of any staff member within the languages service who will come to me and seek to influence my position. So this is what I mean by this idea of zones of influence and zones of control. And I am always open to having conversations either with you, Laura, or with the language sectoral assembly board, or even as part of town halls, so that staff can have a clear understanding of what I can change and what I can't change, but of also what are the areas that I can try and influence with my work with my peers, for example, with Ms. Elizalde as the director of the documentation division, or in my conversations with colleagues in other duty stations where I'm more at the influence as opposed to having control. And from a staff engagement perspective, I certainly encourage all staff in the languages service to reach out to me either through Teams or through email. I'm usually in the office on Friday mornings, and I try and keep my office open for anyone who wants to come and give me their 2 cents about anything that they would like. I'm interested, and these informal conversations do shape my thinking, and they do shape the thinking of the chiefs, and they do shape Kira's thinking as well. And so I think that as we have transitioned to a new work mode, which is that 90% of LS staff are teleworking 3 or more days of the year. If you want to influence conversations, or if you want to influence outcomes, it's also important to come to work. Otherwise, I'm kind of stuck in the position where, hypothetically, if member states were to say, what is the justification for staff to be based in Geneva, I would be very hard pressed to come up with an answer. And if I write to my chiefs to say, what's the advantage of people being in the building, what I'm seeing is actually, people are here 2 days a week. So if people are here 2 days a week, then it's not a priority for them to meet face to face and to have those contacts. So this is an area of concern that I've relayed to the chiefs, but also to the SHP focal points as well. Kira has mentioned that we have a one desk, one person policy, that no one is forcing us to go to the 80%. But the stats, I'd be happy to share them with you, Laura, if you're interested, as to how many people are actually coming to work is a concern to me. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Well, if I could just sort of echo what Michelle said, I really appreciate it when people get in touch with me. And if anybody of you have spent any time with me when I'm focused on something, I know there's like a million questions from me, but hearing things and understanding what's going on, very helpful. And then I follow it up with our colleagues in EAMS to get data on this, because there's a lot of stuff people tell you, and I'm like, well, let's just see if the numbers support it. Digging numbers, getting specific examples, these are very powerful in passing these things back upstream. There's a lot of the stuff we've done in GDoc where we've been able to have this specific information that has helped shape some of the decision making in New York. So anyway, I just want to, but thanks when you take the time to speak up. Yes, please.
Hello. Hi, I'm in the interpretation section. Thank you for the meeting. I don't want to be over dramatic, but interpreters are very worried about one thing at this time. It's our health, our ears. This is our tool for work. So we would like you, well, I would like you, please, Kira, to take that into account when you have to take all these decisions when energy crisis and moving from building to building and changing rooms and all that, and hybrid and all the pressure that you get from member states. We understand all that, but please take into account that many of our colleagues are already suffering. And we really, really would like you to take that into account in all decisions that you make. Thanks.
Thanks so much for raising that. And I definitely, I'm aware of several colleagues who actually aren't able to work in the booth right now, unfortunately. So, which is a big concern. And I work with Marie. Marie's very clear and vocal about discussing that. But this is one of the reasons why we're quite insistent that we're only doing at most 30 minutes of, and we call it active remote participation. So for instance, with video statements, we require the video be submitted in advance with appropriate quality sound, with the transcript, ideally captioning. Very interesting. HRC is way into pushing their videos to have captioning from an accessibility standpoint. But we've tried to sensitize all the member states to that. Every time we have a member state substantive secretariat meeting, we include an aspect of this. And I really want to thank the colleagues who've worked on this, Amy and Martin and other colleagues who've worked to prepare educational materials. We do have it available on the website. We've shared it with other international organizations. We mention it regularly at meetings. I know the Director General has carried this talking point in her meetings with member states to say, listen, you member states need to have the proper equipment. You need to have the proper setup. And we've also spoken a fair bit with Marie about what are the procedures in place when you face a situation where somebody is giving you an intervention with the bad sound. Because I know that this, I mean, I don't know personally, but I imagine and understand that you're there, you want to do the best job possible. You want to hear what they're saying. You're listening very intently and you're in the flow of the meeting. And if the sound is bad, popping out of that flow and thinking, okay, wait, is this good enough? Can we keep going? Wait, we're going to have to stop. And then it's a big drama. Secretariat's upset, the person's upset. We have tried to encourage more use of advanced testing, onboarding for people before the meeting, so the sound tech can say, "Oh, thank you so much, Ambassador, but your microphone, or we can't quite hear you," because by the time the person takes the floor and they're running their 90-second intervention, I talked to somebody who worked with an NGO representative, and she told me that she worked with the guy to practice his speech for hours. They went through like several hours of practice so he could say everything he wanted to say in his time. And what that means is that you're listening to somebody who's talking really fast and blah, 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 and of course it's really hard. So I understand you're under a lot of pressure and it gets worse. We try to do that with education, but as I understand, if you just can't hear, you just have to stop the meeting. And we've talked about how to do that and how to help educate the secretariat. But maybe Marie, you could share some thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Kira, and thank you, Susanna, for saying that, because this, if there is one thing that we take into account in all our discussion, the energy crisis, the SHP, if there is one thing that we take into account, it's that, because we do understand the importance. So I really would like to reassure you that if there is one thing that we take into account, it's really that. We are well aware of it, believe me, well aware of it. So, and I also would like to add that we are also fortunate enough that we, in all of that, we are working in cooperation with management, so in cooperation with Kira. So Kira is well aware of that as well, believe me. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. And I just want to add your point about the energy crisis. There was some loose talk, and it was very loose, about, oh, well, the interpreters can just work remotely from home. And we were like, oh, no. I asked Marie, and Marie was emphatic. Emphatic is a delicate way of putting it. She was very clear that no, this wasn't going to happen. Prisca, you have a question, please.
Thank you, and thank you for holding this meeting. It was very informative, all the information that have been shared with us. I want to go back to the issue of the interpretation, because you said that for the DG, we have the business continuity till mid-2023, which means that we will continue with hybrid meeting. But I think our concern as interpreter is what is going to happen after, when the business continuity will be lifted. Because it's obvious, and when we attend meeting, that it's a matter of convenience for a lot of delegation. When you have an expert who can speak from China through Zoom, he's not going to come to Geneva. And again, as my colleague said, I'm starting personally to have some issues with my ears. I see my colleagues who are no more able to work, and I'm just concerned. And I know that you are doing your best, but how are we going? How are you going to say no to member state, knowing that we are not going to go back to the past whereby everybody will be buying a ticket and coming to Geneva or going to New York to deliver a speech? So again, thank you for all your effort, but I'm curious to know how are you going to drive this issue further with a member state? Thank you.
Is it
Yeah.
same thing?
Problem, sorry. Hi, thank you, Kira. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Susanna and Priska. Kira, you said that you meet regularly with the ASG. Have you got any news about the global survey that Dimash promised us like many, many, many months ago? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the reminder about the global survey. I'll follow up. We'll follow up with Imre because that's been discussed. So I spent a lot of time on the hybrid meeting thing. It's an interesting question. Here in Geneva, people are still keen on hybrid. There's not 100% consensus, but in New York, they're very much into in-person. We've had discussions about this. So ACABQ came here and we briefed them on the conferencing today and tomorrow project. And again, they were interested in understanding what the situation was. Hybrid had been discussed at the Committee on Conference meeting last year. In the end, there was no consensus and the resolution was silent on the issue. So that's how we started this year. There were Committee on Conferences did have a actually probably the most frank and robust discussion. You know how diplomats use that phrase. I'd ever heard in a member state thing. It was really a heavy pointed discussion. There is no member state consensus. And USG Abelian is very clear that we will not get out ahead of the member states on this. So some of the points that he makes routinely is, first of all, there's not ISO compliant. So this goes to the points you've made about the sound quality. There's no universal access. Now, Zoom does allow people to connect from anywhere. However, not all people can get Zoom accounts. So for instance, if you're maybe the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of North Korea, you may not be able to have a commercial Zoom account. So one of the things that's important about the United Nations is universal access. So this is something that's not yet guaranteed. We heard messages from certain key member states, you can imagine who were very concerned about that. There's also some security issues. There's questions about that there's a lot of, not a lot of talk, but right now, when you see Ambassador Smith, like I see Priska in the room, I know it's Priska. I doubt that there's somebody in disguise who's pretending to be Priska. But if you're on a screen, it's people who are bad actors could possibly be what they call deep fakes. So there's some questions about that. So if it's online, plus if you're a diplomat and you want to have a personal discussion or you're floating some trial balloons that maybe are slight deviations from your country's position, you don't want to do that on a screen because who knows who's recording it, who's taking screenshots, where that information is going to be there. So there will always be in-person meetings, I think. Well, I mean, certainly until we have like the holodeck and the metaverse and all that, but certainly for the foreseeable future. So there's a question as to, is there even an interest in having all hybrid all the time? I think what we find is that people, exactly as you said, the expert, does it make sense to fly somebody from China or Vanuatu, where it takes 36 hours to get there, for them to come and make a 15-minute intervention? Maybe, maybe not. But if we were not in business continuity mode, that would be the end of it. So when the Director General says, okay, travel is 100% possible, we don't have any weird capacity constraints or other problems, and we are out of business continuity mode, we are done with hybrid meetings. Now, what we've briefed member states here to that extent and substantive secretariats, and I have said, we will not provide interpretation of active remote participation outside of business continuity. So until the member states have consensus, until they have created a mandate, that mandate will trigger requirements for funding, et cetera. We will not do that outside of business continuity. So my guess is the ACABQ recommended in its report on the budget that the Secretariat might wish to do an assessment of hybrid, what it was like. The position of the USG&D GACM is that requires the GA to approve that recommendation. And it should be clear what's to be included in that. If that happens, then there'll be a lot of work that will be done, and that would be reported to the GA next year, and then there would be more discussion. My personal belief is that this isn't going to be sorted out until certainly maybe late next year, probably more likely the year after. If we are out of business continuity, we'll go back to in-person, and then I think that will help sharpen the thinking of people to see, does this make sense, does it not? And you've seen some bodies didn't want to be in hybrid at all. You know, arms control was like, no, 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 no. Other bodies think it's great. So it's not a one size fits all, but we're following this very closely and we will keep you apprised. But we discuss any presentation we make that touches on that is cleared through the DGACM to make sure that what we are saying is consistent across Fifth Committee, Committee on Conferences, ACABQ, et cetera. So I hope that's helpful. Anybody else in the floor, or shall we go to, are there any online questions for people who are still faithfully waiting? Okay. Okay, so I see a comment from somebody who says, could you please also exert pressure on the Secretariat of UNCTAD, UNECE, OHCHR, and other bodies to come to the meeting room and not intervene from their office through the platform? Are they still doing, they're still doing that?
We did, despite what we told them. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, whoever shared this. Thank you very much, because we have made this point. And, you know, it is an embarrassing scandal. I mean, that sounds very dramatic, but you're sitting there, we talk to people, you tell, oh, Ambassador, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. And then you have somebody joining from their laptop from their office with some little dinky headphones and the sound is bad. This is unacceptable. So yes, I will follow up on that. We'll include that in our communication at the start of the year with the clients, because people need to be in the room. Because if they're not in the room and they're talking, that's part of the 30-minute of remote participation.
Definitely, yes.
Oh yes. Oh yes. No. This is. Oh no. No. So but see, this is exactly what I mean by somebody tells me something and then I can do something about it. But it's super helpful. And if you have concrete examples, that's even more helpful. And then it gets in my head, and then I pester people about it up and down in all directions. So do we have any other comments? Do we want anything? Vitaly, do you want to share anything? I know you haven't. I mean, you don't have to. I'm just asking you, Frank, Marish, anything you wanted to add? So thank you all very, very much. And again, let me extend my appreciation to our Francophone colleagues who had to sit and listen to me speak in English for a very long time. So thank you very much for your patience. Okay, we do have a question. Will all staff have an assigned seat during and after the SHP? Yes, that is the plan. So thank you for asking that. And again, if there's other things that come to your mind later. Oh, question, go.
Also include the interpreters. They will have also an assigned. Okay, thank you.
About what? A table with a table.
Yeah, explain what the lounge is going to be,
No, but
Mary, if you don't mind. But maybe you could share what.
Yeah, no, interpreters are not going in the, you mean after the SHP, when we are going to move our final destination? No, it's not in the H building. No, it's in the AB building. So basically it's not on this side. It will be on the other side where we were before. So we will have a lounge with lockers and everything. Yeah. And tables with computer, tables when you can work and things like that. So we are working on this. Yeah. No, we'll not be in the H building. We are back on where we were basically.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Again, let me extend my appreciation to everyone for their hard work throughout the year. I know it's been a challenging year. Thank you for those of you who've come in person. Thank you for those of you who joined online. Much appreciated. If I don't see you before then, or if you're not able to join us at the holiday party, please let me wish everybody all the best for the end of the year. And whatever you celebrate, I hope it's with family and fun and food, and you have a lovely end to the year. So again, thank you all very much. Much appreciated.